from the University of California at Berkeley.
Welcome to A Conversation with History. I'm Harry Kreisler of the Institute of International Studies. Our guest today is Norman Podhoretz. For 35 years as editor of Commentary magazine, Norman Podhoretz has had a profound influence on the ideas that shaped public debate in the United States. He is the author of 7 books, including Making It, Breaking Ranks, and Exfriends, all of which chronicle his life and times as a writer, literary critic, commentator, and editor. Mr. Podhoretz, welcome to Berkeley.
I'm delighted to be here.
How did your education on the streets of Brooklyn as a young person shape your character?
Well, some people would say that it made me into the pugnacious, obnoxious person I became as an adult. But being a street kid in Brooklyn, which I very definitely was, I was a good boy in school and a bad boy on the streets, and a member of a gang. Of course, we weren't particularly criminal, just mischievous.
And you had a jacket, I read.
I had a red satin jacket with a logo which said Club Cherokees on it, and we were a typical Brooklyn gang of the, I guess this would be the 40s, and the main desideratum was to be tough and not to back down from a fight, and to be a sissy, as people used to say, or a coward, was probably the worst possible condition into which you could fall. So when I later got into political polemics, I think that formation, as the French would call it, began to show itself, manifest itself in the intellectual area as well.
Early on, when you were in school, you came under the influence of a teacher, a woman who wanted to draw you out of your lower class background and introduce you to a higher culture. Tell us a little about that.
Well, this was a high school English teacher and the faculty advisor to the new student newspaper, which I eventually became the editor. And she thought I was very promising. She was of aristocratic background, and she used to call me, just to get my goat, a filthy little slum child, which was an exaggeration. I mean, I was of working class, immigrant, Jewish. My parents were immigrant Jewish. My father was a milkman, delivered milk. But she was a ferocious snob, and she thought I had a lot of talent, and she desperately wanted me to win a scholarship to Harvard. And in order to achieve that, she not only pressed me to do well academically, but also she tried to teach me proper manners. And there's an incident I write about in Making It, which was published way back in 1968, in which she took me out to dinner, and which I didn't know which fork to use and how to use a napkin and so on. And she did this deliberately in order to humiliate me so that I would learn how important it was to master these arts, and therefore be a fit candidate for admission into Harvard.
How did your Jewish heritage impact your later career, do you think?
My Jewish heritage is special in a certain sense because I had a much more intensive Jewish education than most American Jews of my generation. I was born here. I'm born in Brooklyn. As I said, my parents were immigrants. Most kids, like me, had cursory Jewish educations. They would go to school, to a rabbi, and then they at 13 they would have a bar mitzvah, and that would be about it. And the years up to the bar mitzvah, they would have learned nothing except how to do their thing by rote. But my father, my parents were what you might call lapsed Orthodox. I mean, if they were anything, they were Orthodox, but they were not, in fact, all that observant, and they were in flight from the orthodoxy of their background back in Eastern Europe. But my father felt very strongly about Jewish culture, and he insisted on my continuing my Jewish education. So while I was going to high school, I went at night to a Hebrew high school where classes were conducted in Hebrew, and then later, while I was going to Columbia, I did not, despite my high school teacher's ambitions, finally go to Harvard. I went to Columbia, which was okay with her, by the way. I went to the College of Jewish Studies at the Jewish Theological Seminary, which was an academic course in Judaism and Jewish history and so on. So I knew Hebrew. There was a time when I spoke Hebrew fluently, and I knew a lot of the sources, and I was deeply involved intellectually in the Jewish heritage. It shaped me to the extent that it created in me a high regard for this heritage, unlike many of my friends at Columbia who thought there was nothing there and who thought I was crazy for wasting my time on it. Later, although I was never a passionate Zionist when I was young, it later turned me into a passionate defender of Israel when Israel came under assault, especially from the left after 1967.
And it also pointed you in the direction of understanding the resiliency of ethnicity with regard to other groups.
Well, that's a good point, yes. When I became editor of Commentary in 1960, I was then 30 years old. And one of the early, I used to publish segments of books before they came out as books, and I ran a series of pieces by Nathan Glazer and Daniel Patrick Moynihan, which later got collected into a book called Beyond the Melting Pot. And the emphasis of those pieces was that America, the theory of America as a melting pot was highly exaggerated. They didn't say it was wrong, it was highly exaggerated. And that ethnicity remained a significant factor, particularly in the political behavior of the various groups in this heterogeneous society. I hasten to say that this view of American pluralism was very different from the multiculturalism of today, which I oppose. But being as Jewish as I was, in that sense, did certainly give me a strong sense of how important the ethnic background of my own group was, but also gave me a feel for the saliency of the ethnic background of other groups.
You've had a distinguished career as a writer and an editor, and let's talk a little about writing. Do you believe that writing is a gift?
Yes, also a curse.
Tell us how, in what ways?
I don't think you can be taught to, I mean, you can be taught to write correctly, and the English did it for, long. They've lost, by the way, in England, they seem to have lost the knack for teaching people to write correctly. They once had it. But writing in the sense in which you mean, good writing, distinguished writing, writing of high literary quality is something that I believe cannot be taught. And it's something you're born with. You may or may not cultivate it properly, but it's something, and if you're born with it, the reason I say that it can be a curse is that unless you submit to it and try to exercise that gift, it makes you suffer. It's like an unused muscle, or I don't know what the right analogy would be. And I've had times in my life when I've rebelled against writing. I've had what they call writer's blocks, which have been among the more miserable periods of my life, and I've often prayed that I could give up the compulsion to write. I no longer do, but I did finally submit and got over this periodic fall into blocks. There are natural writers, and if you're a natural, you're stuck with it. If you're not a natural writer, it's either impossible to write decently or is a torment.
And you find your voice by finding the materials that you can work with. You seem to be saying in your book.
Well, it's not just materials. I would almost put it the other way around. You have to find a voice before you can before the materials that you wish to deal with will allow you to deal with them. Mm-hmm. And I've sometimes compared this to musicians or composers finding the right key in which to write a symphony or a quartet or something. I don't know anything about music technically, but I know that key is very important. I don't quite understand why, but to me, I have that same experience. I have to find a tone, and I often have abortive starts on pieces or books. Exfriends, my latest book, is the fourth version that I tried. I didn't finish the other three, but I wrote. And in the case of each of my books, and often in the essays I've written, I've started wrong and gone along until I was stopped internally because the voice was not true in the way you might say a musical pitch is true. Until you find that voice, the material resists you. At least that's my experience.
You talk in your new book about Lionel Trilling and in other of your books, who was a very influential teacher, and you say that he taught you that ambition was an admirable quality of character, and he taught you to place a high value on honesty. But I wanted to go to the last point you made. He taught you that confessing to one's true feelings was one of the most courageous and valuable things a writer could do. Is that partly what you mean by finding your voice?
Well, that's, I think, the theoretical basis of it, yes. Your true voice, finding your true voice means that it is you and not someone else who is speaking about whatever it is you're speaking about. You're not being a ventriloquist for someone else. And now what you have to say may not be very interesting or important. And in fact, many writers are afraid that what they have to say is of no great significance, which is why they try to imitate other voices. But the assumption behind what Trilling taught me and what I believe very fervently to this day is that if you're going to write, it's you who must do the writing and not someone pretending to be someone else.
And in doing that, you in a sense deal with your past experience, or you have to. I raise that question because in your chapter on Norman Mailer, in a footnote, you suggest that possibly he never consummated his talent because he didn't confront his Jewish heritage.
Yeah, well, that's a touchy point, but I believe it to be true. Mailer, like me, was born in Brooklyn, although in a slightly higher economic level and in a better neighborhood. He went to the same high school I did, though he's 7 years older than I am, and then he went to Harvard. I learned, even though he and I had been very, very intimate friends for a long time, I never knew until I did some research. I suspected, but I never knew that he had been regarded as this dreaded sissy mama's boy when he was a kid on the streets of Brooklyn. And he spent his entire life trying to extirpate what he himself called the nice Jewish boy from his soul, which is one of the reasons he has done so many outrageous things and gotten into trouble, including with the police. It's part of trying to overcome that lifelong terror of being a sissy. Now, on the other hand, what went along with this package appears to be some refusal to associate himself in any way with his Jewishness, although he came of immigrant Jewish stock, and And you know, so that he made himself into something he wasn't. And to go back to our earlier point, I think that one of the reasons that Mailer never fulfilled the great promise I saw in him when we were both a lot younger is that he did not find, especially in his novels, a true voice. And he pretended to be someone named Sergius O'Shaughnessy in The Deer Park, for example. Well, he knew as much about what it meant to be a person named Sergius O'Shaughnessy as I do, which is named nothing. And there was a certain falsity that crept into his work as a result of his constant evasion, which I think continues to this very day, of confronting what's down deep or bred into his bone.
You wrote in Making It, at bottom, the writer wants coherence and order, coherence in himself and order in the world.
Oh, that's a good sentence. I'd forgotten I wrote that. I'm glad you quoted it. It's a long time. I haven't reread Making It in a very long time, and I wrote it, I think, 35 years ago. Well, I think it's true, and it's certainly true of me. I mean, let me put it this. There are some writers who either are incapable of achieving coherence because their minds live in a state of confusion and even thrive in a state of confusion. And there are some who don't wish to achieve coherence, who think there's something wrong with it, who like the idea of being full of contradictions. You know, Walt Whitman said, I contradict myself, very well then I contradict myself. I contain multitudes. Well, that's okay for a poet like Whitman, but for writers of discursive prose like myself, and I think even for novelists, coherence, which is a very difficult quality to achieve, is of the essence. It makes for lucidity, intelligibility, and in the end, meaning. And without it, you have confusion, which is, in my opinion, not a particularly pleasant state to either to be in or to foster in others.
Your three works, your trilogy, so to speak.
It is a trilogy, you're right.
You use your own experience to explicate the battle of ideas that shape public discourse. Tell us about doing that, because that's really what you're doing.
Well, here I have to be immodest, and I'm not famous for my modesty, so I won't be violating anyone's sense of me out there who knows anything about me. I think I invented this form. I stumbled upon it in an essay, a notorious essay I wrote in 1963 called My Negro Problem and Ours. The form consists of using one's own experience as a means of exploring a larger theme. People have called these books of mine, that's Making It, Breaking Ranks, and Exfriends, memoirs or autobiographies. They are, in my judgment, memoirs or autobiographies. I once tried the word auto case history, but it's not a very graceful word, and it never took. But that's the essence of it. I am the case history on the basis of which whatever theme it is I'm trying to illuminate, or whatever segment of our intellectual or cultural or political history I'm exploring takes place. In Making It, for example, Making It was a book about the role of success and the compulsion for success in American culture. And I used the story of my own career as a jumping off point for talking about attitudes toward success in various segments of our society, where they come from, what they mean, the kinds of hypocrisies they have generated. And Making It was, in its day, an enormously controversial book.
Because you uncovered the dirty little secret.
Well, I said that the dirty little secret is a phrase that I took from D.H. Lawrence and revived. He used it to apply to the Victorian attitude towards sex. I said that the American intellectuals, or at the upper reaches of American culture, the ambition for success was a dirty little secret. Everybody wanted it, but you were not supposed to aspire toward it. William James called it the bitch goddess, and the worship of the bitch goddess was considered corrupting. I said that everybody in America, including intellectuals like me, worshipped the bitch goddess. That's one of the things that made them American. And what's more, there was nothing so terrible about it. In fact, there was a lot to be said in favor of it, and people were outraged by this defense of the pursuit of success. And I use success in the ordinary sense, not in some fancy, success. I'm happy, therefore I'm successful. Mm-hmm. I meant material advancement. Acquiring more money, power, influence, fame, whatever, than you had when you started. Now then I did the same thing in Breaking Ranks on the issue on politics, and Breaking Ranks is the story of how I moved from being a member of what used to be called the movement with a capital M, that is the New Left counterculture, of which, again, to be immodest, I was one of the I suppose, founding intellectual fathers in the late 50s. And
we should say to the audience that as editor of Commentary, you published people like E.F. Schumacher, Walter Goodman, James Baldwin, I believe, among others.
Paul Goodman,
yes.
Norman O'Brown, even Herbert Marcuse at one point. The Stoughton Lind, who was a Cold War revisionist. Yeah, I had pushed the magazine into a position. I inherited it. It was 15 years old when I became the editor. But I turned it into, I suppose, one of the intellectual centers for the dissemination of the ideas and attitudes that, when it didn't even have a name when I started, it became known as the New Left or the counterculture or collectively the movement. Breaking Ranks tells the story of how I became a radical and how I broke with radicalism and why. And again, by using my own experience, I was able to digress, if you like, and not really digress, but jump off into the surrounding areas and talk about everybody else and what was going on in the culture around me, how I reacted to it. But that required an analysis of what was moving in the country at large and in the political, especially in the political culture. Exfriends is a book that covers a lot of that ground, but repeats some of the stories even in Breaking Ranks, but brings the story up to date and does so through the narratives of how I became friends with a number of very notable people, why we became friends, and why and how we broke, which was usually for political reasons when I moved away from the left and in a rightward direction.
Present in all three of these books is what you call the family, the intellectual community that defined highbrow culture, I guess is a simple way of saying it. And in looking back in your last book, you miss that community, and you feel that the country as a whole misses it. You say the absence today of a community like the family constitutes a great loss in the culture. The result is a diminution in the serious discussion of serious ideas.
Yeah, well, I believe that. The family, I guess we ought to be a little more specific, was a term, again, not invented by me, but I guess I made it famous through making it. It was invented by the late columnist Murray Kempton, and it referred to what were later called the New York intellectuals, and I was the runt of that litter. I was the youngest member of
pugnacious runt.
Well, they were all pugnacious. In fact, I was mild compared to some of my elders. Actually, there was one younger member than I. Susan Sontag came along a little later. She's a few years younger than I am. But her relation to the family was more tangential than mine. And I was adopted into the family. Adopted meaning that my stuff was published in partisan review and commentary, which were the two main centers. Commentary before I became its editor. I mean, when I was in my early 20s, I started. I had a precociously early beginning as a published critic. And having been accepted as an intellectual, if not peer, at least an intellectual who was respectable enough to be published, I would then be invited to the parties that were always being given. And a little later, when I got married, I gave them myself. And at these parties, people drank a lot. Nobody drinks anymore, but everybody drank a lot in the 50s and 60s, but mostly they argued and they gossiped, and there was a lot of fun, but there was also a lot of intellectual excitement associated with that life. And the main, although I came to feel that we did a lot of harm, that we were wrong about many things, not everything, but many things, and the harm we did is something I've been trying to undo for the last 30 years of my life. But that aside, the fact that there was a center in which there was a kind of daily, almost hourly, critical examination being applied to the assumptions that govern the conventional wisdom, not just of the political culture, but of the arts. The fact that that existed made for a much more passionate engagement with these very important matters. And the members of the family, to the members of the family, the arts, politics, and the relations between them were matters almost of life and death. I don't see that around me anymore, and I feel its loss in my own life personally, and I think that we, as a culture, have, as you said in the quote, have suffered from its loss, because although we have, as I put it in Exfriends, policy wonks by the thousand, we have very few people who subject the assumptions behind the policies the wonks are wonking about to serious critical examination and try to set them into a broader historical, cultural, philosophical, political, cultural context.
I want to pursue this point and then go off in other directions, but your new book, Exfriends, is really about your breaking with friends like Lillian Hellman, Lionel Trilling, Norman Mailer, and so on. But at the end of the book, Norman Podhoretz, one could say, gets a little soft or teary-eyed. And you say, without your ex-friends, I might never have been forced into discovering what in the depths of my soul I really believed, and I might have been struck forever dumb by the falsity of my own position. The point I would like to talk about is, as a writer, your friendships and your ex-friendships were very important for delineating, shaping, arguing about, and reaching conclusions about the ideas you would embrace.
Absolutely. And this goes back to our earlier discussion about the tone of voice and the honesty of feeling. I have never knowingly written anything that I did not believe to be true at the time I wrote it. In fact, if I had tried, I would have failed. When I was a radical, and I believed, as my son said to me when he was a kid, did you really believe all that stuff? And meaning the radical stuff. And I said, yes, I did really believe all that stuff. But as the years wore on, I became increasingly disillusioned, and events here at Berkeley were one of the first episodes to start me rethinking my radical position. I mean, the 1964 free speech movement and the so-called revolution that started here. But the fact is that as I grew more and more disillusioned with this movement that I had helped to create and to disseminate, I should interrupt by saying that when we started in the late 50s, you know, I exaggerate, but there were about 6 people at the meetings one would go to, and
This was at commentary?
even before commentary, but I mean, I got mixed up with what was then called the peace movement, which was fighting against for a nuclear test ban and disarmament in foreign policy, but there and also we believed in the radical reconstruction of American society and domestically. So you'd go to meetings, and as I say, there would be very few people present. And a late colleague of mine came to a meeting with me once that I was addressing, and she looked around the room. This was in Union Square, in an old Union Hall, and it was a musty place. And there was and she looked around and she said to me, "Every person in this room is a tragedy to some family or other." And that was the way it looked in, say, 1958, 59. I would never have dreamed that the ideas and attitudes that I was then promulgating and that those people accepted would, within 5 or 6 years, sweep the campuses and within 10 years take over the Democratic Party, which they did under George McGovern. It was a little more than 10 years. But as the influence of those ideas grew, something happened to them and something happened to me. I mean, you know, there's a line in T.S. Eliot somewhere, "No, that is not what I meant, that is not what I meant at all." And certainly what shouting speakers down as the misnamed free speech movement did at Berkeley, to take just one of many examples, was not what I meant at all in trying to perfect American society in my utopian radical fantasies. As I grew more and more disenchanted with what was going on, I became more and more uneasy and had a lot of arguments in private with my friends that eventually spilled out into the public prints, and that's when I sort of officially broke ranks and had to break with a lot of these people who thought I'd gone crazy. And those who didn't think I'd gone crazy thought that I had joined the enemy. I was an apostate and was excommunicated. But being a Brooklyn boy, I fought back. I didn't sit back and take it. I let them have it as best I could myself in return. But when I said I would have been struck dumb, I mean exactly that, because there was a point at which either I came out of that particular closet that is of my disaffection with the radicalism with which I'd been associated, or I would have had to bite my tongue. And I mean bite it in speech, and certainly I would have been unable to write. And in fact, I was unable to write for a number of years because I had not reached a point yet where I was quite ready to say what it was that was stirring within me. Partly I didn't yet know exactly what it was. It took a while. It took 4 or 5 years for me to reach a point where I could say coherently what my objections to the radicalism of the 60s were and why I thought it was dangerous and had to be fought against. So in that sense, I found my true voice saying very different things from what my true voice had said 10 years earlier. And if I hadn't, I don't think I could ever have written another word.
That took courage, I presume.
Well, again, I must be immodest. I once said that clarity is courage, or courage is clarity. You can do it anyway. And I believe that very much in the intellectual sphere. I think when you asked me before about coherence, I actually think it's a failure of courage on the part of some people when they are not being clear or courageous. They're covering themselves. They're looking over their shoulders, either the right shoulder or the left shoulder, or both simultaneously. They're afraid to be found out. They're afraid to say things that will get them into trouble. And I think that's especially tragically true on the American campus. It started to be true in the 60s when I actually used the word reign of terror term. It's You know, it was certainly not like the French Revolution. But from that day to this, there are things that you're not allowed to say. And in fact, the joke I often use is that on certain campuses, maybe all campuses, and not just campuses, certain corporations, if you say certain things, federal marshals will materialize out of the air and read you your rights and handcuff you. So there's a reason that people are afraid to strive for clarity, and but it does take courage, because there are consequences, even short of the ones I'm talking about. The consequences are that you're going to make enemies. If you take a strong position, you will make enemies, period. And if you're not prepared to live with that consequence, then you either shut up or you pretend to think things that you don't.
Before we talk about this change, the ideas, the particular issues that you focused on as you're thinking about the great issues change, I want to focus on the fact that you weren't just making this transition as a writer, but also as an editor. And I want to talk a little about that role, because you were the editor-in-chief of Commentary magazine, which throughout the period was very influential. You write in one of your books about being an editor. It was as though the peculiar pleasure of getting inside someone else's mind, and yet managing to keep a firm enough hold on one's critical sense to prevent oneself from being swallowed up by that other mind once inside, had been a lifelong craving of my soul, which at long last found its object and been satisfied. So that became...
Where did I say that?
I believe you said it in... yes, yeah.
Well, again, I didn't remember it.
Yeah.
Well, I agree with it.
Yeah.
Editorial talent is one of the rarest of all talents, much rarer than literary talent, for example, because it requires two qualities that rarely go together in the same person. On the one hand, it requires great arrogance, because the editor has to assume he knows better than the author about things that the author knows more about, usually. But at the same time, it requires great humility, because it means subjecting your own skills to the ideas of someone else. In other words, what you're trying to do is, if you're the kind of editor I tried to be for nearly 40 years, what you're trying to do is make this manuscript as good as it possibly can be in its own terms. You're not imposing on it. You're trying to realize what it's trying to say more perfectly than the author was capable of doing. So there are very few people who are both supremely arrogant and supremely humble, and not to mention possessed of some of the other skills it takes to be an editor, that is the literary skills, and also the sense of the climate out there, what's interesting, what's important. So all these qualities are necessary to make a really good editor, and there are very few people who possess them all. There are many people who possess one or the other, but not all of them in combination. And I was a natural. When I went to work as an editor, as an assistant editor at Commentary in my late 20s, I was handed a manuscript written by someone who had been born in Germany and who did not write English very well, a very famous person. And I knew exactly, first of all, the fame didn't intimidate me, and secondly, I mean, nobody told me what to do. They just said, put this into English or something. And I knew exactly what to do with this piece. I don't know why or how, but I did. And what's more, I did it, and it succeeded. So I realized then that this was something I was born to do. And
that became an important tool for finding the ideas that would shape the public debate.
Well, the last quality I mentioned was a more important tool than that. That is the sense of what was moving out there in the culture. As an editor, again, this is the arrogance expressing itself in a slightly different context. I took the view that what was interesting and exciting to me was interesting and exciting in general. that I was in fact not idiosyncratic or eccentric, though I might be a bit ahead of the zeitgeist that was shaping up. And I had great confidence in my sense of the movement of ideas and attitudes. So in finding writers and in finding subjects and in marrying the two together and then in rewriting what they gave me, I was indeed able to exert a kind of influence that if I had not been in control of a magazine, I obviously would not have been able to do. I was also writing, but we had a team. I was the general of an army. And later, when I broke, I compare this when I broke with the left. There were very few of us. Again, just as there had been at the beginning when I moved to the left. And I used to compare it to those movies in which you got 1,000 Indians. I guess you're supposed to say Native Americans now. Attacking, 6 cavalrymen, and the 6 cavalrymen are behind a bunch of rocks, and they run from one rock to another, firing. So the Indians will think that there are more of them there than there are, and that was a little bit the way it was for us, both when I began as a radical and I began as an anti-radical. But the armies grew as, the other detachments of cavalry began to show up. You raise a standard, especially with clarity, and there are people who will rally around. There are also what I call Marranos. Marranos were forced converts to Christianity, Jews who were forced to convert to Christianity by the Inquisition in medieval Spain, but who secretly practiced Judaism down in their cellars. And I use that term for people who secretly agreed with me but didn't dare to say so. And I would give a lecture somewhere. It might be the University of California, or it might be the University of... And the audience would be very hostile. But afterward, a bunch of people would come up to me and they'd whisper, "I really agree with you." And they'd slink off before somebody caught them.
You really were then, in these two roles as writer and editor, both a patron saint and a leader of the neoconservative movement. And briefly, I want to touch upon the core ideas that were at stake here. And I don't know that we can go into detail on all of them, but this was really an argument about U.S.-Soviet relations on the one hand, and secondly, it was an argument, you say, about attitudes toward America. Let's talk a little about that.
Okay. Well, neoconservative means new. The prefix means new conservative. We neoconservatives were new in the sense that we had all begun somewhere on the left, radical, liberal, whatever, but somewhere on the left. And it also suggested, so we were new to conservatism, but we also brought something new to conservatism. It was a different kind of conservatism. I just wanted to get that clear, and I can't go into what was new about it as conservatism, but the two issues you mentioned were key. The U.S.-Soviet conflict. We took the position, which I still hold, that the conflict between the United States and the Soviet Union was as close as you can come in human history to a conflict between good and evil. All good in the human realm is relative. There's no such thing as absolute good. But we've learned in our century that there are things that are very close to being absolutely evil. And I think totalitarianism, as Hannah Arendt, one of my ex-friends, taught me, she used the term absolute evil to describe totalitarianism, of which the two main mutations were Nazism and communism under Stalin particularly. So we regarded, some of us came to regard, or the U.S.-Soviet conflict, or the Cold War, as a battle with the same political and moral weight as the war against Nazism. And we were on the American side, passionately, and we were anti-Soviet. Now, most of the left by the late 60s was anti-American, as you might say, and were certainly not Cold Warriors of any stripe. So that was one very important point. The second point, which was related, organically related, had to do with the nature of American society. If I'd had my way, this movement, it wasn't really a movement, it was more like a tendency, neoconservatism, would have been called neo-nationalism, because what it really represented a rediscovery of the values and virtues of American society, and I was and am an American nationalist, an American patriot, whichever word you like to use, and so were all the other neoconservatives. We loved this country, and we came more and more to believe that the traditional attitude of our fellow intellectuals, which ranged from mild disdain to outright hatred, was wrong and dangerous, that this was a society worth defending, and that it embodied a precious institutional heritage that was under assault externally from the power of the Soviet Union, and internally from ideas such as some of the ideas that we ourselves had been propagating, and that our fellow intellectuals had been propagating for at least 100 years or more. So we took to defending America, and we became pro-American and anti-Soviet. And we considered most of our ex-friends on the left as anti-American. We didn't just consider them, they were. That is, they said things like America was not only rotten in itself and could only be saved by a revolution, but that it was the main cause of evil in the world at large, and the main enemy of the aspirations of the poor and the downtrodden everywhere. We violently disagreed with this view, and so we were pro-American and anti-American, as you might say.
What is your view, after having gone through this amazing life of shaping ideas, what is your view of the role that intellectuals should properly play in political life?
Well, you know, people are free to choose whatever view they wish to hold, and I mean, as I just said, if it were up to me, all intellectuals would be defending the kind of society. Let me add to this, you know, that I think American civilization is one of the high points of human achievement. As a socio-political system, I compare it to 5th century Athens. I mean, we have not in the cultural sense, that is, we don't do too badly in the creation of artistic monuments, but we don't rank with 5th century Athens or 19th century England or Elizabethan England. But as a socio-political democratic system, I think we will be seen, if there is a future, and there are future historians, as one of the highest points of human achievement, because we've created a society in which more people enjoy more freedom and more prosperity than any human community ever known to human history. And that's not nothing, to put it mildly. I wish everybody recognized that. Many people still don't. But I'm going to answer a question you didn't ask me. What should be the role of ideas? What should be the role of intellectuals? I am the opposite of a Marxist, as it won't surprise you to hear. I mean, I do not believe that it's the economy stupid, which is James Carville, of course, said that, but it's a Marxist idea that the economy shapes events. I think, on the contrary, it's ideas that shape events. They are the moving force in history. Everything begins with an idea in somebody's head. And the best thing John Maynard Keynes ever said was that practical men who think that they're indifferent to ideas always turn out to be the slaves of some defunct economist, or I would add defunct philosopher or defunct intellectual. There is a trickle-down effect, and people are influenced by thinkers of whom they've never heard, and they don't know this, and these invisible forces are shaping how they feel and think about a whole range of issues in their own personal lives, not to mention in the society in which they live. So I think intellectuals are supremely important, and I lament the fact that the American intellectual class has played what I consider, on the whole, a destructive role. I think if intellectuals understood better than they do, they pretend to think they agree with Shelley, that he said poets are the unacknowledged legislators of the world. I would say intellectuals in the general are the unacknowledged legislators. If they took their own power more seriously, perhaps they would exercise it in what I regard as a more responsible fashion. But even when they don't exercise it in a more responsible fashion, they do serve to force into focus what the assumptions that lie at the basis of the way we live and the way we feel and the way we think and the way we raise our kids and the way we relate to our wives and husbands and so on.
I have one or two more questions for you. What would you, your book, Exfriends, is dedicated to your grandchildren.
Yeah, I've got 10 of them.
10, and 4 children. What would you like your grandchildren to take in the way of a lesson from this intellectual journey that we've been talking about?
Well, I would hope they would take away some of the things I've been saying here, and I hope that they would, first of all, learn to place the kind of value on this country that I think it deserves. Secondly, I hope that they would learn to understand how important ideas are. Some of them, the oldest are 18, and they've already learned that, I think. One of the best reviews of Exfriends was written by one of my grandchildren. It was a very favorable review. And I would hope that they would also understand the idea that was most eloquently expressed by George Orwell. Unfortunately, at my advanced age, my memory isn't what it is, and I'm not going to be able to quote it exactly. But Orwell said, "The truth," something like this, "the truth to which we have got to cling as a drowning man to a raft, is that it is possible to be a normal, decent human being and still be fully alive." And I endorse that view with all my heart, and I would hope that my grandchildren would learn to endorse it as well.
Mr. Podhoretz, thank you very much for taking time to be with us today and talking about your life, your ideas, and the times in which you lived.
Thank you for having me.
And thank you very much for joining us for this conversation with history.